The champagne flute trembled in my hand as my husband stood up at our anniversary dinner, tapping his knife against the crystal to get everyone's attention. Our closest friends and family turned expectantly toward Paul, their faces glowing with warmth and celebration. "I have an announcement to make," he said, his voice carrying that confident tone I'd fallen in love with 20 years ago, something that's going to change everything.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're a subscriber, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Tell us a duh.
I smiled encouragingly, assuming he was about to surprise me with another romantic gesture. After all, this was our 20th anniversary celebration at the country club where we'd had our first date. Everything was perfect. The candlelit ambiance, the table decorated with white roses, our daughter Sienna beaming beside me in her elegant blue dress. But as Paul's words continued, my smile froze on my face. This wasn't the loving tribute I'd expected. This was something else entirely. "Amanda and I have had a wonderful run," he continued, his eyes avoiding mine completely. "But sometimes life takes you in unexpected directions. I've found someone who makes me happy in ways I'd forgotten were possible." The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear my own heartbeat, the distant clink of silverware from other tables, the whispered gasps of shock from our friends. But all I could focus on was the envelope I'd placed in my purse earlier that evening, the one I'd been carrying for 3 weeks, waiting for the right moment. Or perhaps, waiting for the worst moment. I stood up slowly, calmly, and reached for my purse. "Since we're making announcements," I said quietly, my voice steady as glass, "I have something for you too." The envelope was cream-colored, heavy stock, with Paul's name written in my careful cursive. I placed it next to his champagne glass and sat back down, meeting his confused gaze for the first time that evening. "What is it?" he asked, his confident demeanor suddenly uncertain. "Open it and find out," I replied, taking a sip of my champagne. It tasted like victory. But to understand how we got to this moment, I need to take you back to where it all began, to the life I thought was perfect and the woman I used to be. 6 months earlier, my world was exactly what I'd always dreamed it would be. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen windows of our colonial home in Westfield's most prestigious neighborhood, illuminating the fresh white peonies I'd arranged in a crystal vase. At 42, I moved through our beautiful space with the practiced grace of someone who genuinely loved creating a perfect home. "Morning, gorgeous," Paul said, appearing in the doorway wearing his charcoal Armani suit. Even after 18 years of marriage, he still made my heart skip a beat. At 45, he'd maintained the athletic build that had first caught my attention in college, though his dark hair now showed distinguished silver at the temples. "I made your favorite," I said, sliding a plate of Eggs Benedict across our marble island. The hollandaise sauce was perfectly smooth, the English muffins toasted to exactly the right shade of golden brown. "You mentioned last night that you had an important meeting with the Morrison account today." Our daughter Sienna rushed into the kitchen like a whirlwind of teenage energy, her long auburn hair, so much like mine had been at 16, flowing behind her as she grabbed an apple from the bowl I'd arranged with artistic precision. "Mom, can you pick me up from debate practice today? We're preparing for the state championship, so it might run until 6:30. "Of course, sweetheart," I smiled, already mentally adjusting my afternoon schedule. After dropping Sienna off, I had a consultation with the Chen family about their complete home renovation, a project worth nearly $200,000 that would cement my interior design firm's reputation among the city's elite. Paul looked up from his iPhone, fingers pausing mid-text. "Actually, I'll probably be very late tonight. This Morrison deal is crucial for making partner, and you know how these client dinners can run." I nodded with the same understanding smile I'd perfected over nearly 2 decades of marriage. Paul Bellini was one of the top financial advisors at Klein & Associates, the most prestigious wealth management firm in the state. His success had afforded us this beautiful life, the 6-bedroom house with its perfectly manicured gardens, Sienna's private school education, our membership at the country club, my ability to be selective about which design projects I accepted. "That's fine, honey. Sienna and I can have our girls' night. Maybe we'll order Thai food and watch one of those romantic comedies you pretend to hate." Paul's smile seemed genuine as he kissed my cheek, though I noticed he smelled different, a subtle cologne I didn't recognize mixing with his usual scent. You're the best, Amanda. I don't know what I'd do without you keeping everything running so smoothly. After he left, backing his BMW out of our circular driveway while already on another phone call, I stood in our kitchen feeling that familiar sense of satisfaction. This was my domain, every detail curated to perfection. The subway tile backsplash I'd imported from Italy, the farmhouse sink I'd found at an antique market in Provence during our last anniversary trip, the custom cabinetry painted in the exact shade of cream I'd spent weeks perfecting. My phone buzzed with a text from Victoria Klein, my college roommate turned best friend and now one of the city's most successful family law attorneys. Coffee at 2 p.m.? I have drama about the hospital charity gala that you won't believe. I typed back quickly, perfect, the Gallery Cafe? Victoria and I had maintained our friendship through marriages, career changes, and the general chaos of adult life. She was one of the few people who truly understood the pressure of maintaining appearances in our social circle while building successful careers. As the wife of the firm's senior partner, she navigated the same delicate balance of supporting her husband's ambitions while pursuing her own. Our life had a rhythm that felt both comfortable and meaningful. Mornings started with family breakfast, afternoons were dedicated to my design consultations, evenings centered around homework help and family dinners. Weekends brought a social calendar filled with country club events, charity fundraisers, and dinner parties with other successful couples. I'd built my interior design business, Bellini Interiors, from nothing into one of the most sought-after firms in the area. My portfolio included magazine-worthy homes for tech executives, medical professionals, and old-money families who'd been in Westfield for generations. Each project was a puzzle I solved through careful attention to my clients' personalities, lifestyles, and aesthetic preferences. The work satisfied something deep in my soul, the same impulse that made me arrange fresh flowers every morning and plan elaborate dinner parties. I created beautiful spaces where families could build memories, where couples could find romance, where children could feel safe and loved. Standing in my own kitchen that morning, surrounded by evidence of everything I'd worked to create, I felt profoundly grateful. Not everyone was lucky enough to build their dream life with their college sweetheart, to raise a daughter who was both academically gifted and genuinely kind, to work in a field that felt more like passion than profession. I had no idea that in just a few hours, I would discover the first crack in my perfect world, a crack that would eventually reveal that everything I thought I knew about my marriage was carefully constructed fiction. The first crack in my perfect world appeared 3 weeks later during our monthly dinner at Chez Laurent, the intimate French bistro where Paul had proposed 19 years ago. We sat at our usual corner table, surrounded by flickering candlelight and the soft murmur of other couples enjoying romantic evenings. But something felt different. Paul's attention kept drifting to his phone, which lay face down beside his wine glass like a sleeping serpent. Every few minutes, the screen would illuminate with an incoming message, and I'd watch his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. "The Morrison account is really ramping up," he explained when I commented on his distraction. "Blake Morrison is incredibly hands-on with his portfolio management, wants constant updates, detailed reports, immediate responses to market fluctuations." I paused, my fork halfway to my mouth with a bite of perfectly prepared duck confit. "Blake Morrison? I thought you said you were working with Morrison Industries Investment Committee." Paul's wine glass stopped midway to his lips for just a fraction of a second before he recovered smoothly. "Blake is Morrison Industries. Well, he's the heir apparent. His father started the company, but Blake's been taking on more responsibility as the old man prepares to retire. Brilliant mind for investment strategy, but very demanding about communication." I nodded, filing away the slight inconsistency. Paul had been mentioning the Morrison account for months, describing late meetings with the Morrison team and complex negotiations with Morrison executives. This was the first time he'd mentioned working directly with Blake Morrison himself. "He sounds challenging," I said carefully, studying my husband's face in the candlelight. There was something guarded in his expression, a slight tension around his eyes that I'd never noticed before.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
All the best clients are challenging, Paul replied, his smile not quite reaching those same eyes. But the commission on this account will set us up beautifully. Maybe we can finally take that trip to Tuscany you've been wanting. The conversation moved on to safer topics: Sienna's upcoming debate tournament, the progress on the Chen renovation, our friend's latest drama, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. Paul seemed to be performing the role of devoted husband rather than simply being one. 2 nights later, while organizing Paul's home office to prepare for our housekeeper's deep cleaning, I found a receipt that had slipped behind his mahogany desk. Dinner for 2 at Rossini's, an upscale Italian restaurant I'd been wanting to try for months. The date was last Tuesday, the same night Paul had claimed to be working late at the office with documents too sensitive to remove from the building. I held the small piece of paper in my hands, studying the details. 2 entrees, a bottle of expensive Chianti, dessert, coffee. The total was over $300, not the kind of meal someone orders for a working dinner with colleagues. This was the kind of dinner you have when you're trying to impress someone. When Paul came home that evening, I was waiting in the kitchen with a glass of wine and what I hoped was a casual expression. "How was your day, honey?" I asked, watching his face carefully. "Exhausting," he sighed, loosening his silk tie with practiced efficiency. That Tuesday meeting with the Morrison documentation ran until almost midnight. We had to order Chinese takeout just to keep everyone fed. Chinese takeout, not Italian cuisine at Rossini's. I felt something cold settle in my stomach, but I kept my voice light and interested. "That sounds brutal, but at least you're making progress with such an important client." Paul nodded, moving toward the stairs. "I'm going to grab a quick shower before dinner. This day just felt endless." I watched him disappear upstairs, the receipt still burning a hole in my pocket. There had to be an explanation. Perhaps he'd taken a different client to dinner earlier in the week and gotten confused about which night was which. Perhaps the receipt was from a previous week and had just been sitting behind his desk for a while. But as the days passed, the inconsistencies began multiplying like a malignant growth. Credit card charges at restaurants I'd never heard of, in neighborhoods I'd never visited. Late meetings that seemed to happen with increasing frequency, always with vague explanations about client demands and market volatility. Paul's phone, once casual left on counters and charging stations, now stayed constantly in his possession. The changes in his behavior were subtle but persistent. He showered immediately upon coming home, instead of collapsing on the couch to decompress like he had for years. His clothes started smelling of an unfamiliar cologne, something woody and expensive that definitely wasn't the Armani Code I'd been buying him every Christmas. He'd developed new tastes in music, suddenly playing jazz artists I'd never heard him mention before. "Everything okay at home?" Victoria asked during our weekly coffee date at the gallery. Her sharp attorney's instincts had always made her perceptive about relationship dynamics, and she was studying my face with professional concern. "Just the usual stuff," I said, stirring my latte with more focus than necessary. "You know how it is after 18 years. Sometimes you go through phases where you feel like strangers living in the same house." Victoria's expression softened with understanding, but I could see the wheels turning behind her eyes. "If you ever need to talk or need any professional advice, you know I'm here for you, right? Sometimes an outside perspective can help clarify things." I appreciated her concern, but pushed aside my growing unease. Successful marriages required trust and communication, not paranoid investigations based on circumstantial evidence. Paul had never given me any real reason to doubt his commitment to our family. These were probably just the normal growing pains of a long-term marriage navigating middle age and career pressures. But the breaking point came on a Thursday evening 3 weeks later, during what should have been a peaceful family dinner. Sienna was telling us about her latest debate victory when Paul's phone rang with a tone I'd never heard before, a soft, melodic chime that was distinctly different from his usual notifications. He glanced at the screen and his entire demeanor transformed. His shoulders straightened, his expression softened, and when he answered, his voice dropped to a tone that was almost intimate. I need to take this, he said, stepping onto our back patio. Through the French doors, I watched my husband pace back and forth among my carefully tended rose bushes, animated in a way I hadn't seen in months. His free hand gestured as he spoke, his face more expressive and engaged than it have been during any conversation with me recently. The call lasted 15 minutes. When he returned to the table, he was smiling in a way that made my chest tighten with something I didn't want to name. "Sorry about that," he said, not meeting my eyes. "Crisis with the Morrison account. You know how these clients can be." But I'd been watching through the glass. That hadn't looked like a crisis call. That had looked like a man talking to someone who made him genuinely happy. The 20th anniversary celebration had been my idea, planned with the meticulous attention to detail that had become my signature in both my marriage and my design work. I'd reserved the private dining room at Westfield Country Club, the same elegant space where we'd celebrated Sienna's Sweet 16 and countless other family milestones. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables dressed in crisp white linens, and I'd personally arranged centerpieces of white roses and baby's breath, the same flowers from our wedding bouquet. 24 guests filled the intimate space. Our closest friends, Paul's business partners from Klein & Associates, my college sorority sisters, and family members who'd traveled from 3 states to celebrate what everyone believed was a fairy tale marriage. Victoria Klein sat to my right, stunning in navy silk, while her husband Anthony held court at the opposite end of the table with Paul's golf buddies. Even my usually reserved mother-in-law, Marie Bellini, had flown in from Phoenix, wearing the pearl necklace I'd helped Paul select for her 70th birthday. Sienna looked radiant in the midnight blue dress we'd chosen together during a mother-daughter shopping trip the previous weekend. At 16, she was becoming a beautiful young woman, with my auburn hair and Paul's confident bearing. She'd been so excited about tonight, helping me plan every detail and even writing a short speech about how our marriage had shown her what true partnership looked like. The evening had unfolded perfectly through 3 courses of the club's finest cuisine. Conversations flowed as smoothly as the expensive wine Paul had selected from the club's reserve collection. Our friends shared favorite memories of our relationship, from our college days when Paul would drive 2 hours every weekend just to take me to dinner, to the early years of our marriage when we'd hosted elaborate dinner parties in our tiny starter apartment. To Amanda and Paul, Mark Strauss had toasted during the main course, raising his glass of Bordeaux. The couple who proves that true love isn't just for fairy tales. You've built something beautiful together, not just your marriage, but your entire life. I'd felt genuinely moved by the warmth surrounding us, by the evidence of the life we'd created together. This was what success looked like. A loving family, loyal friends, respect in our community, and the financial security to celebrate our milestones in style. But as the evening progressed, I noticed Paul becoming increasingly restless. He checked his phone repeatedly despite the formal nature of the occasion. His responses to toasts and compliments seemed mechanical, delivered with his professional charm but lacking genuine warmth. When our friend Brendan Cross shared a humorous story about our early marriage, Paul's laugh felt forced. Then, just as dessert was being served, a perfect recreation of our wedding cake in miniature, Paul stood up abruptly. The scrape of his chair against the hardwood floor cut through the gentle conversation like a knife through silk. "I have something I need to say," he announced, his voice carrying that confident boardroom tone I'd heard 1,000 times during his business calls. The room fell silent. All 24 pairs of eyes turned toward my husband expectantly, assuming this was the romantic speech I'd been hoping he'd prepare. I smiled encouragingly, thinking perhaps he'd finally planned the grand romantic gesture that had been missing from our recent interactions. "Amanda and I have shared 20 incredible years together," Paul began, his gaze fixed somewhere above our guests' heads, carefully avoiding direct eye contact with me. The past tense registered in my mind like a discordant note, but I maintained my smile, assuming he was building towards something beautiful. "But sometimes life takes you in directions you never expected," he continued, his voice gaining strength and conviction. Sometimes you meet someone who opens your eyes to possibilities you'd forgotten existed. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Victoria's hand found mine under the table, her fingers cold with shock. Across the table, I saw Anthony Klein's face go pale as he began to understand what was happening.
"I've found someone who makes me feel alive again," Paul said, finally looking directly at me for the first time that evening. "Someone who reminds me what passion feels like, what it means to be truly understood and appreciated." The silence that followed was absolute. I could hear the distant sound of music from the main dining room, the soft tick of the antique clock in the corner, my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. Sienna's face had gone white, her young eyes wide with disbelief and growing horror. "Her name is Heaven Cross," Paul continued, oblivious to the devastation spreading across the faces of everyone who loved us. "We've been together for 8 months, and she's shown me what it means to be truly happy. She understands my ambitions, supports my goals, and doesn't make me feel guilty for prioritizing my career." The last sentence hit me like a physical blow. 20 years of supporting his career, of managing our household so he could focus on his ambitions, of putting his success ahead of my own needs, and this was how he characterized my devotion? "I know this comes as a shock," Paul said, his tone taking on that patronizing quality he used with difficult clients, "but I hope you'll all understand that sometimes we have to choose happiness over obligation, passion over habit." Marie Bellini made a sound like she'd been slapped. Victoria's grip on my hand had become painful, her attorney's mind probably already racing through the legal implications of this public humiliation. But it was Sienna's face that broke my heart, my daughter staring at her father like she was seeing a complete stranger. "I've filed for divorce," Paul announced, with the casual tone of someone discussing weekend plans. "Amanda will be well taken care of course. I'm not a monster. But Heaven and I are planning to be married as soon as the paperwork is finalized." The room erupted in shocked whispers and barely contained gasps. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded in my lap, watching 24 people I cared about struggle to process what they'd just witnessed. Paul looked around the room expectantly, as if waiting for congratulations or at least understanding. Instead, he found faces filled with disgust, disappointment, and disappointment. That's when I stood up, calmly walked to my purse, and retrieved the envelope I'd been carrying for 3 weeks. "Since we're making announcements tonight," I said quietly, my voice steady as steel. The envelope felt heavier than it should have as I walked back to the table, my heels clicking against the hardwood floor in a rhythm that seemed unnaturally loud in the stunned silence. Every eye in the room followed my movement, but I felt strangely detached from their stares, as if I were watching myself from above. Paul's confident expression wavered as I approached. He'd clearly expected tears, pleading, or perhaps an explosive emotional outburst that would justify his narrative of an unhappy wife who couldn't appreciate his need for fulfillment. Instead, he found himself facing a woman who moved with the calm precision of someone who'd been preparing for this exact moment. "What is that?" he asked, his voice losing some of its earlier authority as I placed the cream-colored envelope next to his untouched dessert plate. "Open it and find out," I replied, settling back into my chair with the same composed grace I'd maintained throughout his devastating announcement. The envelope was elegant in its simplicity, heavy cardstock in ivory, with Paul's name written across the front in my careful cursive handwriting, the same handwriting that had addressed our wedding invitations, signed countless anniversary cards, and penned love notes during the early years of our marriage when such gestures still mattered to him. Paul's fingers hovered over the envelope like it might explode. The businessman who had just confidently demolished our family's foundation in front of 24 witnesses suddenly looked uncertain, almost afraid. "Dad," Sienna whispered, her voice barely audible. Paul didn't answer. His attention was completely focused on the envelope, as if he could divine its contents through sheer force of will. Around the table, our guests sat frozen in their seats,
caught between the impulse to flee this increasingly uncomfortable scene and the morbid fascination of watching a 20-year marriage implode in real time. Victoria leaned closer to me, her legal training evident in the way she studied both the envelope and my unnaturally calm demeanor. "Amanda," she murmured, so quietly only I could hear, "what did you do?" I took a sip of my wine, a perfectly balanced Pinot Noir that Paul had selected for our anniversary dinner, and met her concerned gaze with a smile that felt foreign on my own face. I protected myself. Across the table, Anthony Klein was watching his business partner with growing alarm. As the senior partner at Klein & Associates, Anthony had built his reputation on discretion and maintaining the firm's sterling image in the community. Paul's public announcement of his affair and pending divorce was exactly the kind of scandal that could damage the firm's carefully cultivated reputation among Westfield's elite families. "Perhaps we should give Paul and Amanda some privacy," Anthony suggested diplomatically, starting to rise from his seat. "No," I said firmly, my voice cutting through the room's tension. "Stay. All of you. After 20 years of marriage, I think our friends and family deserve to witness how this story ends." Paul's face flushed red at my words. He was beginning to understand that this evening wasn't unfolding according to his script. He'd expected to control the narrative, to present himself as a man bravely choosing authentic happiness over comfortable obligation. Instead, he found himself facing a wife who refused to play the role of devastated victim. "Amanda, let's discuss this privately," he said, his tone taking on the condescending patience he used with difficult clients. "There's no need to create a scene." "Create a scene?" I repeated, my voice still maddeningly calm. "You just announced your affair and your intention to divorce me in front of our anniversary dinner guests, including our 16-year-old daughter, but I'm the one creating a scene?" The logic was unassailable, and Paul's flush deepened. Around the table, I could see our guests beginning to process not just the shock of Paul's announcement, but the calculated cruelty of his timing and venue. This wasn't a man making a difficult but honest choice about his happiness. This was a man deliberately humiliating his wife in the most public way possible. Mark Strauss cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Paul, maybe you should think about—" "Open the envelope," I interrupted, my gaze never leaving my husband's face. "Everyone's waiting." Paul picked up the envelope with hands that trembled slightly. His earlier confidence had evaporated, replaced by a growing unease that was evident to everyone in the room. Whatever he'd expected from this evening, it clearly hadn't included a mystery envelope delivered with such calm certainty by the wife he'd just publicly discarded. He turned the envelope over, examining the sealed flap as if looking for clues about its contents. The seal was neat and precise, secured with the same attention to detail I brought to every aspect of our life together. "Just open it, Dad," Sienna said, her young voice cracking with strain. "Please." But Paul seemed frozen, caught between curiosity about the envelope's contents and fear of what he might find inside. The confident businessman who just announced his new life with Heaven Cross was gone, replaced by a man who looked genuinely afraid of his wife's response to his betrayal. The silence stretched between us like a taut wire, filled with the weight of 20 years of shared history and the anticipation of whatever revelation the envelope contained. Our guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, caught in the middle of what was clearly a carefully orchestrated confrontation. I reached for my water glass, taking a small sip while maintaining perfect composure. Let him sweat. Let him wonder. After 8 months of lies and deception, after choosing to humiliate me in front of everyone we knew, Paul could experience a few moments of uncertainty. "The anticipation is killing me," murmured, her lawyer's instincts recognizing the strategic nature of my calm response. I smiled at my best friend, feeling genuinely peaceful for the first time in months. Good things come to those who wait. Finally, Paul's curiosity overcame his apprehension. With shaking fingers, he slipped his thumb under the sealed flap and tore open the envelope, the sound unnaturally loud in the expectant silence. What he found inside would change everything. The sound of papers rustling filled the silence as Paul unfolded the documents from the envelope. I watched his face carefully, noting the exact moment when comprehension dawned. His eyes widened first, then his face went completely pale, the color draining from his cheeks like water from a broken glass. "What?" he started, then stopped, his voice catching in his throat. His hands began to shake as he scanned the official letterhead, the legal terminology, the signatures that made everything binding and irrevocable. "What?" he demanded, his patience finally exhausted. As the senior partner of the firm, he'd built his career on controlling situations, and this evening was spiraling far beyond his ability to manage the fallout. Paul's mouth opened and closed several times before any sound emerged. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "You transferred everything?" "Transferred what?" Sienna asked, looking frantically between her parents. At 16, she was old enough to understand that her world was crumbling, but still young enough to hope that somehow the adults would fix this nightmare. I took another sip of wine, savoring the moment I'd been planning for 3 weeks. The house, the investment accounts, the business assets, everything that was jointly owned is now in my name alone. The reaction was immediate and electric. Victoria's sharp intake of breath, Anthony's muttered curse under his breath, Marie Bellini's shocked gasp. But it was Paul's expression that I found most satisfying, the look of a man who just realized he'd been playing chess while his opponent was playing a completely different game. "That's impossible," Paul said, his voice gaining strength as his businessman's mind tried to process what he was seeing. "You can't just transfer assets without my knowledge. I would have had to sign papers, authorize transfers." "Check the dates," I said, calmly, cutting off his protest. Paul's eyes flew back to the documents, scanning for the signatures and timestamps that would tell the story of his own downfall. I watched the exact moment when he found what he was looking for, saw his face crumble as the implications hit him. 8 months ago, he whispered. 8 months ago, I confirmed. The same week you started working late every Tuesday. The same week you suddenly developed a passion for Italian restaurants I'd never heard of. The same week you began your relationship with Heaven Cross. The name hung in the air like a curse. Around the table, our guests were beginning to understand that they weren't just witnessing a marriage's end. They were watching a masterfully orchestrated revelation of betrayal and consequence. Victoria leaned forward, her legal mind immediately grasping the implications. "Amanda, how did you—" "Power of attorney," I explained, never taking my eyes off Paul's devastated face. "Something we signed years ago for estate planning purposes. Perfectly legal, completely binding. I simply exercised the authority Paul had given me to protect our family's interests." Anthony Klein's face had gone ashen as he began calculating the professional ramifications. "Paul, tell me you didn't promise firm assets to support this situation." But Paul wasn't listening to his business partner. He was staring at the papers in his hands like they were written in a foreign language. "You've been planning this for 8 months?" he said, his voice hollow with disbelief. "I've been protecting myself for 8 months," I corrected. "There's a difference." Mark Strauss, ever the peacemaker, attempted to inject some rationality into the chaos. "Surely this can all be worked out through lawyers. These things are complicated, but with good legal counsel." "There's nothing to work out," I said firmly. "Paul made his choice when he decided to betray our marriage. I made mine when I decided not to be a victim." Sienna suddenly stood up, her chair scraping against the floor. "I can't. I need some air," she managed, before rushing toward the French doors that led to the club's terrace. The sound of her heels clicking rapidly across the floor was like gunshots in the stunned silence. Several of our female friends immediately rose to follow her, their maternal instincts overriding the awkwardness of the situation. I started to get up as well, but Victoria placed a gentle hand on my arm. "Let them handle it for a moment," she murmured. "Sienna needs to process this without feeling like she has to choose sides right now." Paul was still staring at the documents, his mind clearly racing through the implications. Without the house, without access to our joint accounts, without the financial security he'd promised Heaven Cross, his grand romantic gesture suddenly looked less like a brave new beginning and more like a catastrophic miscalculation. "Heaven's going to kill me," he muttered, apparently forgetting that he was still in a room full of people who had just learned about his affair. The words hung in the air like a confession, confirming what everyone now understood. Paul's announcement tonight hadn't been about love or authentic happiness. It had been about a man who'd promised his mistress a lifestyle he could no longer deliver. Anthony Klein stood up abruptly, his face grim with the realization that his business partner had just become a significant liability. "Paul, we need to talk, privately, now." But Paul seemed incapable of movement, frozen in his chair, with the papers that had just destroyed his carefully laid plans scattered before him like the remnants of his old life. "Heaven's going to kill me," he muttered, apparently forgetting that he was still in a room full of people who had just learned about his affair. The words hung in the air like a confession, confirming what everyone now understood. Paul's announcement tonight hadn't been about love or authentic happiness. It had been about a man who'd promised his mistress a lifestyle he could no longer deliver. Anthony Klein stood up abruptly, his face grim with the realization that his business partner had just become a significant liability. "Paul, we need to talk, privately, now." But Paul seemed incapable of movement, frozen in his chair, with the papers that had just destroyed his carefully laid plans scattered before him like the remnants of his old life. To understand how I'd anticipated Paul's betrayal by 8 months, I need to take you back to a cold March evening when everything I thought I knew about my marriage began to unravel. It started with something as simple as a forgotten phone charger and a husband who suddenly couldn't bear to be separated from his device. Paul had been in the shower when his phone buzzed on our bedroom nightstand. Normally, I wouldn't have given it a second thought. We'd always been comfortable with each other's phones, sharing passwords and occasionally answering each other's calls when one of us was busy. But that night, Paul's reaction when he emerged from the bathroom and saw me holding his phone was unlike anything I'd ever witnessed. "What are you doing with that?" he demanded, his voice sharp with an edge I'd never heard before. I looked up from where I'd been sitting on our bed, his phone in my hand, confused by his aggressive tone. "Your mother called. I was going to tell you when you got out, but then Victoria texted about tomorrow's charity meeting, so I thought I'd—" "Don't!" Paul practically lunged across the room, snatching the phone from my hands with such force that I actually flinched. "I've told you before about answering my phone. There are confidential client matters that you can't—" "Paul," I interrupted, staring at this stranger wearing my husband's face. "I wasn't answering your calls. I was just holding it. And since when do you care if I see your messages? We've shared phones for 18 years. Something flickered across his expression. Guilt, perhaps, or fear? He forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Sorry, honey, you're right. It's just been a stressful week with this new client, high-profile stuff that requires extra discretion." But the damage was done. For the first time in our marriage, Paul had created a wall between us, and that wall was his phone. From that night forward, the device never left his possession. He took it to the bathroom, kept it on his nightstand while he slept, and carried it from room to room like a lifeline to another world. The second red flag appeared 2 weeks later, during what should have been a routine evening at home. Paul had claimed to be working late again, the 4th time that month, when I decided to surprise him with his favorite takeout from Ming Garden. Klein & Associates' office building was only 15 minutes from our house, and I'd done this countless times over the years when his schedule got overwhelming. But when I arrived at the gleaming glass tower downtown, the parking garage was nearly empty. The security guard at the front desk, a kind older man named Billy who'd known me for years, looked confused when I asked if Paul was still upstairs. "Mrs. Bellini, I haven't seen your husband since about 4 o'clock, he said, checking his log with genuine concern. "Are you sure he said he'd be working late tonight?" I stood in the marble lobby of Paul's office building, holding containers of still warm Chinese food, processing the fact that my husband had lied to me. Not a small, innocent lie about forgetting to take out the trash or being late because of traffic. A deliberate, calculated lie about where he was spending his evening. Maybe he had a client dinner, I suggested weakly, more to myself than to Billy. Could be, Billy agreed kindly, but I could see the sympathy in his eyes. He'd been working security in that building for over a decade. He'd seen enough cheating spouses to recognize the signs. I drove home in a daze, the smell of Paul's favorite General Tso's chicken filling my car and making my stomach turn. When he arrived home 3 hours later, I was waiting in our kitchen with the untouched takeout containers still sitting on our marble island. "You didn't have to wait up," he said, loosening his tie with practiced efficiency. "The Morrison meeting ran incredibly late. We had to order pizza just to keep everyone functional." "How was the General Tso's?" I asked quietly. Paul froze, his hand halfway through removing his tie. "What? You said you ordered pizza, but I can smell Chinese food on your clothes." The silence that followed stretched between us like a chasm. I watched my husband's face cycle through several expressions: surprise, calculation, and finally, a condescending smile that made my blood run cold. "Amanda, honey, I think you're imagining things. We definitely had pizza. Maybe you're smelling the takeout you got for yourself?" But I hadn't opened the containers. The food sat exactly where I'd placed it hours earlier, untouched and growing cold. Paul was lying to me again, this time to my face, with the kind of smooth confidence that suggested he'd had practice. That night, lying in bed next to a man who'd become a stranger, I made a decision that would change everything. If Paul was going to lie to me, I was going to find out why. If he was going to betray our marriage, I was going to be prepared. The investigation began the next morning, and what I discovered would destroy every assumption I'd made about the man I'd loved for 20 years. My transformation from trusting wife to private investigator began with something as mundane as our monthly credit card statements. For 18 years, I'd handled our household finances while Paul managed our investments and major financial decisions. It was a division of labor that had worked seamlessly, until I started looking at our expenses with the suspicious eye of a woman who'd caught her husband in multiple lies. The first anomaly appeared on our American Express statement: Bella Vista, an upscale Italian restaurant in Harbor Heights, 30 miles from Paul's office. The charge was for $287, dated on a Tuesday evening when Paul had claimed to be working late on client presentations. The amount suggested an intimate dinner for two, complete with wine and dessert, definitely not a quick business meal. I sat in my home office, surrounded by 3 months of financial statements spread across my antique mahogany desk, and began creating a timeline. Each suspicious charge got a red mark on my calendar. Each late night Paul claimed to be working got a blue mark. The pattern that emerged was damning in its consistency. Every Tuesday for the past 3 months, Paul had a mysterious dinner charge at expensive restaurants I'd never heard of. Every Tuesday, he came home claiming exhaustion from late client meetings. And every Tuesday, he smelled faintly of perfume that definitely wasn't mine, something floral and expensive that lingered on his shirts despite his immediate post-work showers. "Victoria," I said during our weekly coffee date, choosing my words carefully, "hypothetically speaking, if someone suspected their spouse of having an affair, what would be the best way to gather evidence?" Victoria Klein had been practicing family law for 15 years. She'd seen every variation of marital betrayal imaginable, and her sharp green eyes immediately focused on my face with laser intensity. "Hypothetically?" she repeated, raising one perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "Hypothetically." Victoria leaned back in her chair at the Gallery Cafe, studying me with the same careful attention she gave hostile witnesses during depositions. "Well, hypothetically speaking, documentation is everything: financial records, phone records, photographs, social media activity. But Amanda," she leaned forward, her voice dropping to a more personal tone, "are we talking about Paul?" I took a sip of my latte, buying time while I decided how much to reveal. Victoria was my closest friend, but she was also married to Paul's business partner. Whatever I told her could potentially impact both our marriages and Paul's career. "I'm probably being paranoid," I said finally,
but there have been some inconsistencies lately. I just want to know if my instincts are right or if I'm creating problems where none exist." Victoria's expression softened with understanding. "Trust your instincts, Amanda. In 20 years of practice, I've learned that wives almost always know when something's wrong. They might not want to admit it, but they know." That conversation gave me the permission I needed to dig deeper. Over the next week, I became a forensic accountant of my own marriage, cataloging every suspicious charge, every unexplained absence, every small lie that I'd previously overlooked or rationalized away. The credit card records revealed a second life I'd never suspected. Charges at jewelry stores during his lunch hours, but I hadn't received any unexpected gifts. Purchases at lingerie boutiques in downtown shopping districts where Paul claimed to be attending business meetings. Hotel charges for single nights when he was supposedly traveling to conferences that, when I researched them online, either didn't exist or had been scheduled for completely different dates. But it was the phone records that truly broke my heart. Our family plan allowed me to access detailed billing information, and what I found there painted a devastating picture. Starting in early February, just weeks after our romantic Valentine's Day dinner, Paul had been exchanging hundreds of text messages with a number I didn't recognize. The frequency was staggering, sometimes 30 or 40 messages in a single day, concentrated during business hours when he should have been focused on his clients. The calls to this mystery number followed a pattern too. Brief conversations during his commute, longer calls during lunch hours, and extended conversations late in the evening after I'd gone to bed. I began staying awake, listening for the soft murmur of Paul's voice from his office downstairs, confirming what the phone records already told me.
On a Wednesday evening in mid-April, I heard him laughing, actually laughing, during one of these late-night calls. It was a sound I hadn't heard from him in months, certainly not during any conversation with me. The joy in his voice was unmistakable, and it was being shared with someone else. That's when I hired the private investigator. Marcus Lintz came highly recommended by Victoria, though she'd suggested him for a different client's case months earlier. He was a former police detective who specialized in matrimonial investigations, with a reputation for discretion and thoroughness. When I met him at his downtown office, a small space above a coffee shop that smelled like vanilla and disappointment, I felt like I was crossing a line I could never uncross. "Mrs. Bellini," Marcus said, reviewing the file I'd compiled of financial records and suspicious behavior patterns, "this is very thorough work. You've essentially done half my job already." "I need to know the truth," I said simply, "whatever it is." What Marcus discovered over the next 2 weeks would shatter every remaining illusion I had about my marriage. Marcus Lintz's first report arrived via encrypted email on a gray Thursday morning in late April. I opened it while sitting in my car outside Sienna's school, having just dropped her off for her SAT prep class. The parking lot was nearly empty, giving me the privacy I needed to confront whatever truth Marcus had uncovered. The photographs hit me like physical blows. Paul, captured through a telephoto lens, walking hand in hand with a woman I'd never seen before down the tree-lined streets of Harbor Heights Historic District. She was younger than me, probably early 30s, with platinum blonde hair that caught the afternoon sunlight like spun gold. In the photos, she was laughing at something Paul had said, her face turned up toward him with an expression of genuine adoration that I recognized because I'd once looked at him the same way. But it was the second set of photographs that truly devastated me. Paul and this woman, Heaven Cross, according to Marcus's research, sitting across from each other at an intimate corner table in Bella Vista, the same restaurant that had appeared on our credit card statements. Paul was leaning forward, completely absorbed in their conversation, his hand covering hers on the white tablecloth. His expression was more animated and engaged than I'd seen it in years. The final photo in the sequence showed them kissing in the restaurant's parking lot beside Paul's BMW, her arms wrapped around his neck as if she never wanted to let him go. Marcus's investigation had been thorough and devastating. Heaven Cross, age 32, was a freelance marketing consultant who specialized in social media strategy for small businesses. She'd been divorced for 3 years and had no children, which explained her flexibility for Tuesday evening dinners and spontaneous weekend trips.
She lived in a trendy loft apartment in Harbor Heights' converted warehouse district, the kind of edgy, artistic neighborhood that Paul and I had once talked about exploring but never quite found time for. The report included her social media profiles, which Marcus had accessed through what he diplomatically called investigative techniques. Heaven's Instagram account was a carefully curated collection of artistic coffee shots, sunset photos, and inspirational quotes about living authentically and following your heart. But it was her Facebook profile that revealed the true scope of Paul's deception. For the past 6 weeks, Heaven had been posting cryptic but telling updates about her life-changing romance with a brilliant, successful man who makes me feel like the woman I was always meant to be. She shared articles about second chances and finding love later in life, accompanied by photos of expensive flower arrangements that I now realized Paul had been purchasing during his extended lunch hours. One post, dated just 3 days earlier, showed a photograph of 2 wine glasses on a restaurant table with the caption, "When someone shows you that fairy tales can come true even when you're not expecting it. #blessed, #new chapter, #worth the wait." The wine glasses were sitting on the distinctive marble tabletop of Rossini's, another restaurant that had appeared on our credit card statements. But Marcus had uncovered something even more damaging than just an affair. Heaven Cross wasn't just Paul's mistress, she was his business client. Klein & Associates had been managing her investment portfolio since February, which meant Paul had violated every ethical guideline his profession demanded. He'd mixed business with pleasure in a way that could destroy not just his marriage, but his entire career.
The implications were staggering. Anthony Klein had built his firm's reputation on absolute integrity and discretion. If it became known that one of his partners was romantically involved with a client, it could trigger regulatory investigations, client withdrawals, and potentially criminal charges for breach of fiduciary duty. Marcus's report included copies of communication between Paul and Heaven that went far beyond typical client correspondence. Emails that started professionally gradually became personal, then intimate, then explicitly romantic. Paul had used his company email system to conduct his affair, creating a digital paper trail that any competent attorney could use to destroy him professionally. The timeline Marcus had constructed was particularly painful. Paul's first meeting with Heaven had been on February 14th, Valentine's Day. While I was at home preparing his favorite dinner and planning our romantic evening together, he was across town falling in love with another woman during what was supposed to be a routine investment consultation. The affair had progressed rapidly from there. Within 3 weeks, they were meeting for coffee after their official business meetings. By March, they were having dinner dates disguised as client entertainment. By April, they were spending entire afternoons together at her apartment, with Paul using fictitious client emergencies to explain his absences from the office. But the most devastating discovery wasn't about the affair itself, it was about what Paul had been promising Heaven. According to text messages Marcus had obtained, Paul had been painting me as a cold, unsupportive wife who stifled his ambitions and made him miserable. He told Heaven that our marriage had been dead for years, that we were staying together only for Sienna's sake, and that he was planning to leave me as soon as our daughter graduated from high school. More damning still, Paul had been promising Heaven a future that required my complete financial destruction. He told her about our house, our investment accounts, our comfortable lifestyle, and he'd promised her that it would all be theirs once he divorced me. Sitting in my car outside Sienna's school, reading about my husband's plans to destroy my life for another woman's benefit, I made a decision that would change everything. If Paul wanted to play games with our future, I was going to make sure I won. The final straw came on a rainy Saturday afternoon in early May, during what should have been a perfect family day. Sienna was at a friend's house studying for her upcoming AP exams, and I'd planned a quiet afternoon with Paul, something we hadn't shared in months. I'd made his favorite lunch, opened a bottle of the Burgundy we'd been saving for a special occasion, and hoped we might rediscover some connection beyond the polite strangers we'd become. Paul seemed distracted throughout lunch, checking his phone repeatedly despite my obvious attempts to engage him in meaningful conversation.
When I suggested we take a walk through our neighborhood, something we used to do every weekend when we were newlyweds, he claimed he needed to review client portfolios for Monday morning meetings. "It's Saturday, Paul," I said gently, trying to keep the hurt out of my voice. "Can't Klein and Associates survive without you for one afternoon?" "You don't understand the pressure I'm under," he replied, his tone dismissive in a way that felt like a slap. "Some of us have responsibilities that can't be ignored just because it's convenient." The implication that my work wasn't as important as his stung, but I'd grown accustomed to Paul's increasing condescension. What happened next, however, crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. His phone rang at exactly 2:47. I remember the time because I was looking at the kitchen clock, wondering how much longer I could pretend our marriage wasn't disintegrating. Paul glanced at the screen, and his entire demeanor transformed. The bored, irritated husband disappeared, replaced by someone vibrant and alive. "I need to take this," he said, stepping onto our back patio. But this time, instead of respecting his privacy as I had for months, I moved closer to the French doors. Through the glass, I could hear fragments of his conversation, and what I heard destroyed any remaining hope for our marriage. "No, baby, of course I miss you too," Paul was saying, his voice soft with an intimacy he hadn't shown me in years. "This is killing me, pretending everything is normal when all I want is to be with you." I pressed closer to the glass, my heart hammering as I strained to hear more. "I know it's hard, but we have to be patient just a little longer," Paul continued, pacing through my carefully tended rose garden. "Amanda doesn't suspect anything, and once I file for divorce, we can stop hiding. I promise you, Heaven, by Christmas we'll be living together in that house you love so much."
The house I love so much. He was talking about our home, the house I'd spent 15 years decorating and perfecting, the house where I'd raised our daughter, the house that represented everything I'd worked to build. And he was casually promising it to his mistress like it was his to give away. "No, don't worry about the money," Paul was saying, his voice taking on that confident business tone. "Amanda will get whatever the court mandates, but she's not exactly career-focused. She'll be fine in some little apartment somewhere. You and I deserve the life we've dreamed about." Some little apartment somewhere? After 20 years of marriage, 18 years of supporting his career, 16 years of being the perfect corporate wife who entertained his clients and managed his household, this was how Paul saw my future. Dismissed to some little apartment, while he in heaven enjoyed the life I'd helped him build. But it was his next words that shattered my heart completely. "She's gotten so boring over the years, Heaven. No ambition, no passion for anything except redecorating rooms and hosting dinner parties. Being with you reminds me what it feels like to be with a woman who actually challenges me intellectually." I stood frozen behind the glass door, listening to my husband describe me as boring and passionless to the woman he was betraying me with. The woman who didn't know that Paul's success had been built on my sacrifices, my emotional labor, my willingness to subordinate my own dreams to his ambitions. "I love you too," Paul said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Just give me a few more months to handle the legal stuff, and then we can start our real life together." When he ended the call and turned back toward the house, I was already in motion. By the time he opened the patio door, I was sitting at our kitchen island, calmly sipping my wine as if I'd been there the entire time. "Everything okay?" I asked with the same pleasant interest I'd been faking for months. "Just client stuff," Paul lied smoothly. "You know how it is." But I didn't know how it was anymore. I didn't know this man who could lie to my face with such practiced ease, who could dismiss 20 years of marriage as a minor inconvenience to be handled through legal paperwork. I didn't know this stranger who saw me as boring and dispensable, worthy only of some little apartment, while he built a new life with a younger woman. That evening, after Paul went to bed early, claiming exhaustion, I sat in my home office and made the phone call that would change everything. "Victoria," I said when my friend answered, "I need your help, and I need you to promise me that what I'm about to tell you stays between us, regardless of your relationship with Anthony." "Amanda, you're scaring me. What's wrong?"
Paul's having an affair, and he's planning to divorce me. But more than that, he's planning to destroy me financially and emotionally, and I'm not going to let that happen. The war for my future had officially begun. Victoria's law office felt like a sanctuary when I arrived the following Monday morning, clutching a leather portfolio filled with 3 months of evidence. The walls were lined with law books and framed degrees, creating an atmosphere of competence and authority that I desperately needed. Victoria had cleared her entire morning schedule after our weekend phone call, and her usual warm demeanor had been replaced by the sharp focus of a predator sensing blood in the water. "Show me everything," she said without preamble, settling behind her mahogany desk with a legal pad and 3 different colored pens, her ritual for complex cases that required strategic thinking. I spread Marcus Lintz's photographs across her desk first, watching Victoria's expression harden as she studied the images of Paul and Heaven together. Then came the financial records, the phone logs, the copies of Paul's emails that Marcus had obtained through methods I preferred not to examine too closely. "Jesus, Amanda," Victoria muttered, scanning through Paul's correspondence with Heaven. "He's not just having an affair, he's planning your complete financial destruction." "That's why I need your help," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "Not as my friend, but as the best family law attorney in the state. I want to protect myself, and I want to do it in a way that Paul never sees coming." Victoria leaned back in her leather chair, her green eyes calculating. "You realize that what you're asking could destroy not just Paul's marriage, but his entire career? If Anthony finds out that Paul's been having an affair with a client, it could bring down the whole firm. Paul should have thought about that before he decided to promise my house to his mistress," I replied coolly. "I'm not interested in protecting him from the consequences of his own choices."
For the next 2 hours, Victoria outlined a strategy that was both elegant and ruthless. The key was timing and legal positioning. If I moved too early, Paul might have time to counter my actions. If I waited too long, he might successfully hide assets or transfer money to accounts I couldn't touch. "The power of attorney you and Paul signed 5 years ago is your golden ticket," Victoria explained, pulling out a thick file folder. "It gives you the legal authority to make financial decisions on behalf of the marriage, especially regarding jointly held assets. But surely there are limits to what I can do without his knowledge." Victoria's smile was sharp as a blade. "Technically, yes. Practically, if you move fast and cover your tracks properly, Paul won't know what hit him until it's far too late to undo the damage." The plan Victoria outlined was sophisticated and multi-layered. First, we would quietly transfer ownership of all jointly held assets into my name alone, using the power of attorney as legal justification. The house, our investment accounts, even Paul's precious BMW could be moved into my sole ownership through carefully worded legal documents. Second, we would document Paul's affair with meticulous precision, building a case for adultery that would influence any future divorce proceedings. Virginia was still a fault-based divorce state, meaning Paul's infidelity could significantly impact the division of assets and spousal support obligations. Third, and most devastatingly, we would prepare to expose Paul's professional misconduct to the appropriate regulatory authorities. His affair with a client violated numerous ethical guidelines and could result in the loss of his financial advisor's license. The beauty of this approach, Victoria explained, sketching out a timeline on her whiteboard, is that Paul's own arrogance works against him. He's so confident that you're oblivious to his affair that he's not taking any precautions to protect himself legally or financially. "How long do we have?" I asked, studying the complex web of legal maneuvers Victoria had outlined. "I'd say 6 to 8 weeks to get everything in place. After that, Paul might start making moves of his own, especially if Heaven is pressuring him to leave you soon." Victoria introduced me to her team of specialists over the following weeks. Sarah Milliken, a forensic accountant who could trace every penny Paul had spent on his affair and quantify the financial damage to our marriage.
Blake Strauss, a private wealth manager who could help restructure our assets in ways that would be difficult for Paul to challenge. And most importantly, Brendan Cross, a former prosecutor who specialized in professional misconduct cases and could build an airtight complaint against Paul's professional licenses. The irony of Brendan's last name wasn't lost on me. Cross, the same surname as the woman who was destroying my marriage. But where Heaven Cross represented everything I was losing, Brendan Cross represented my path to justice. Mrs. Bellini, Brendan said during our first meeting, I want you to understand the nuclear option we're preparing here. If we file professional misconduct charges against your husband, his career is essentially over. This isn't just about divorce. This is about permanently destroying his ability to work in his chosen profession. I thought about Paul's dismissive comments about my lack of ambition, his casual plans to dump me in some little apartment somewhere, his promises to give Heaven the life I'd helped him build. Mr. Cross, I replied, my husband forfeited his right to my mercy when he decided to treat our marriage like a business transaction. I want him to understand exactly what it costs to betray someone who trusted him completely. Over the next month, Victoria's team worked with military precision to dismantle Paul's life while he remained blissfully unaware of the trap closing around him. Each document we filed, each asset we transferred, each piece of evidence we compiled brought me closer to the moment when I would reveal exactly how much Paul had underestimated the boring wife he planned to discard. The envelope I would hand him at our anniversary dinner was already prepared, waiting for the perfect moment to detonate Paul's carefully constructed new life. The asset transfers began on a Tuesday morning in June, exactly 3 months after I'd caught Paul in his first lie about working late. Victoria had chosen Tuesday deliberately, the same day of the week that Paul spent his afternoons with Heaven, lost in their fantasy romance while I systematically dismantled his financial future. Remember, Victoria said as we sat in the offices of Meridian Trust, the private wealth management firm that would handle the transfers, everything we're doing today is completely legal. You have power of attorney, you're acting to protect marital assets, and Paul signs these authorizations 5 years ago.
Blake Strauss, our wealth manager, spread the documents across his conference table like a general planning a battle. Each paper represented a piece of Paul's life that he'd taken for granted, never imagining that the boring wife he dismissed could orchestrate such a comprehensive financial coup. The house transfer is the most complex, Blake explained, pointing to a thick stack of legal documents. But since you're both on the original deed and you have power of attorney, we can execute a quitclaim deed that removes Paul's ownership interest entirely. I signed my name with careful precision, each stroke of the pen feeling like a small act of justice. The house where Paul planned to play happy family with Heaven, the house I'd spent 15 years perfecting, would remain mine regardless of what happened to our marriage. The investment accounts are more straightforward, Blake continued. Joint accounts can be converted to individual accounts with proper authorization. Your husband will retain access for now, but legal ownership transfers to you immediately. More signatures, more small victories. Paul's retirement fund, our stock portfolio, even the college savings account we'd established for Sienna, all of it moved into my name alone while Paul was across town telling Heaven about their bright future together. The BMW proved trickier. Since it was titled in Paul's name alone, I couldn't transfer ownership directly, but I could do something even more satisfying. The loan on the vehicle is secured by joint marital assets, Sarah Milliken, our forensic accountant, explained. Since you now own those assets outright, you can call in the loan and demand immediate payment. If Paul can't pay, which he can't, since his access to liquid funds will be severely limited, the vehicle gets repossessed. How long would that take? I asked. 2 weeks, maybe 3, just long enough for him to think his life is stable before the ground disappears beneath his feet. While Victoria's team worked on the financial dismantling, I focused on the social preparation. Paul's announcement needed to happen in front of the right audience, people who mattered to both our reputations.
Witnesses who would remember his cruelty and my dignity when the gossip inevitably spread through Westfield's tight-knit social circles. Our 20th anniversary provided the perfect opportunity, a celebration Paul couldn't avoid without raising suspicions, attended by everyone whose opinion might influence our future divorce proceedings. I planned every detail with the same meticulous attention I brought to my design work, except this time I was designing Paul's public humiliation. The guest list required careful consideration. Anthony Klein needed to be there to witness his business partner's professional misconduct firsthand. Paul's mother deserved to see what kind of man her son had become. Our longtime friends needed to understand that I wasn't the bitter ex-wife spinning lies, but the wronged party maintaining dignity under impossible circumstances. Our 20th anniversary provided the perfect opportunity, a celebration Paul couldn't avoid without raising suspicions, attended by everyone whose opinion might influence our future divorce proceedings. I planned every detail with the same meticulous attention I brought to my design work, except this time I was designing Paul's public humiliation. The guest list required careful consideration. Anthony Klein needed to be there to witness his business partner's professional misconduct firsthand. Paul's mother deserved to see what kind of man her son had become. Our longtime friends needed to understand that I wasn't the bitter ex-wife spinning lies, but the wronged party maintaining dignity under impossible circumstances. "You're taking a huge risk," Victoria warned during one of our strategy sessions. "If Paul changes his mind about the announcement, if he gets cold feet and decides to confess privately instead, you'll be sitting there with an envelope full of legal documents and no dramatic moment to reveal them." "He won't change his mind," I said with certainty born of 20 years of marriage. "Paul's ego won't let him sneak around anymore. He's fallen in love, and he wants the world to know how happy heaven makes him. He'll want to control the narrative, make himself the hero of his own story." I was right, of course. Paul had been dropping hints for weeks about having something special planned for our anniversary dinner. He'd insisted on the private dining room at the country club, claiming he wanted to make this celebration memorable. He'd personally approved the guest list, ensuring that everyone who mattered to him professionally and socially would be there to witness his grand announcement. What Paul didn't realize was that I'd been planning my own announcement for months. The final piece of the trap was the envelope itself. Victoria had prepared it with theatrical flair, heavyweight paper, formal legal language, and enough official seals and signatures to make it clear that this wasn't some hastily prepared revenge fantasy. This was a carefully executed legal strategy that had been months in the making. "When do you plan to give it to him?" Victoria asked as we reviewed the final documents. "After he destroys our family in front of everyone we know. After he shows our daughter and our friends exactly what kind of man he really is. After he burns every bridge he'll need to rebuild his life." "And if he doesn't open it immediately?" I smiled, thinking of Paul's inability to resist a mystery, his compulsive need to control every situation. "He'll open it. His curiosity won't let him wait, especially when he realizes that I'm not falling apart the way he expects." 3 weeks later, I sat at our anniversary dinner, surrounded by everyone we'd built our life with, and watched my husband prepare to announce his new beginning. He had no idea he was about to discover the ending I'd written for him instead. Paul's hands trembled as he unfolded the documents from the envelope, the expensive paper rustling in the sudden silence of the country club's private dining room. I watched his face with the detached fascination of a scientist observing a critical experiment, noting the exact moment when comprehension began to dawn. His eyes moved across the legal letterhead first, Victoria's firm name, embossed in elegant gold script, then down to the document titles: Transfer of Real Property, Asset Reallocation Agreement, Professional Misconduct Complaint. Each page represented months of careful planning, and I could see Paul's mind struggling to process the implications. "What is this?" he whispered, his voice barely audible above the soft classical music playing in the background. "Read it," I said calmly, taking another sip of the champagne that suddenly tasted like victory.
All of it. Around the table, our guests sat frozen in their seats, caught between the impulse to flee this increasingly uncomfortable scene and morbid fascination with watching a 20-year marriage implode in real time. Anthony Klein had gone pale, his legal mind already calculating the professional ramifications of whatever Paul was discovering. Paul's face cycled through a series of expressions as he read: confusion, disbelief, growing horror, and finally, a kind of shocked recognition that his perfectly planned new life had just evaporated like morning mist. "You transferred the house?" he said, his voice hollow with disbelief. "The investment accounts, everything." 8 months ago, I confirmed, my voice steady as granite. "The same week you started working late every Tuesday. The same week you began your relationship with Heaven Cross." The name hit the gathering like a physical blow. Several people gasped audibly, while others exchanged meaningful glances. Paul's mother, Marie, made a sound like she'd been slapped, her hand flying to cover her mouth in shock. "You've been planning this for 8 months," Paul continued, his businessman's mind finally grasping the scope of my strategy. While you were promising my house to your mistress," I interrupted, my composure never wavering. "While you were telling her I was boring and passionless. While you were planning to leave me in some little apartment somewhere so you could build a new life with my money?" Victoria leaned forward slightly, her professional curiosity evident as she watched her carefully crafted plan unfold exactly as we'd predicted. Anthony Klein, meanwhile, was studying the documents over Paul's shoulder, his face growing increasingly grim as he recognized the legal and professional disaster his business partner had created. "The professional misconduct complaint," Anthony said quietly, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. "Paul, tell me you didn't have an affair with a client." Paul's silence was answer enough. Around the table, the implications began sinking in for everyone present. This wasn't just a messy divorce. This was professional suicide, committed by a man who'd thought himself too smart to face consequences. "Heaven Cross has been a Klein & Associates client since February," I said, addressing Anthony directly. "I have copies of all the emails, the text messages, the dinner receipts charged to the company credit card, everything your regulatory board will need to see." Anthony's face went ashen. Klein & Associates had built its reputation on absolute integrity and discretion. A partner having an affair with a client could trigger regulatory investigations, client withdrawals, and potentially destroy the firm's credibility among Westfield's elite families. "You bitch," Paul snarled, his composed facade finally cracking. "You vindictive, scheming—" "Careful," Victoria interrupted smoothly, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd eviscerated hostile witnesses in courtrooms for 15 years. "You're speaking to your wife in front of 24 witnesses. I'd hate for your divorce proceedings to include testimony about verbal abuse in addition to adultery and professional misconduct." Paul's mouth snapped shut, but his eyes blazed with a fury that made several people shift uncomfortably in their seats. This was a man realizing that the game he thought he was winning had actually been over for months. "How?" he demanded, his voice breaking slightly. "How? How did you know?"
"You became sloppy," I replied simply. "Careless. Arrogant. You assumed I was too stupid or too devoted to notice that my husband had become a stranger. You thought I'd sit quietly while you dismantled our life for another woman's benefit." Sienna, who had been silent throughout this devastating revelation, finally spoke up. "Dad," she said, her young voice cracking with pain, "is this true? Have you really been cheating on Mom?" Paul looked at his daughter, our beautiful, intelligent daughter who'd always adored him, and for the first time that evening, I saw genuine remorse flicker across his features. But it was too late for remorse. The damage was done, and everyone in that room now understood exactly what kind of man Paul Bellini really was. "Sienna, sweetheart, it's complicated." "No," Sienna said firmly, her voice gaining strength. "It's really not complicated at all. You either cheated on Mom or you didn't. You either lied to our family or you didn't. You either planned to steal our house for another woman or you didn't."
The silence that followed was deafening. Paul sat surrounded by the wreckage of his reputation, holding documents that proved his wife had outmaneuvered him completely, facing a daughter who was looking at him like he was a stranger. His phone started ringing. Heaven's name flashed across the screen, and everyone at the table could see it. "Answer it," I suggested quietly. "I think she deserves to know that the house you promised her was never yours to give." Paul stared at his phone as Heaven's name flashed across the screen for the third time, his face a mask of growing panic. The confident businessman who had announced his new life just minutes earlier was gone, replaced by a man who looked genuinely terrified of the conversation he was about to have. "Go ahead," I encouraged, my voice carrying just enough steel to make it clear this wasn't a suggestion. "Tell her about your evening." With shaking hands, Paul answered the call. "Heaven, I can't really talk right now." "Don't you dare hang up on me, Paul Bellini," came the sharp response, loud enough for half the table to hear. Heaven's voice carried the kind of fury that suggested she'd been trying to reach him for some time. "I've been calling you for an hour. How did the announcement go? Are you finally free?" The irony wasn't lost on anyone at the table. Paul was indeed free. Free from his marriage, his financial security, his professional reputation, and apparently free from any chance of the future he'd promised his mistress. "Actually, there's been a complication," Paul said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What kind of complication?" Heaven's tone shifted from anger to concern, though I could detect an underlying note of suspicion that suggested she was beginning to sense something was very wrong. Paul looked around the table desperately, as if one of our guests might somehow rescue him from this conversation. Finding no help, he took a shaky breath and delivered the news that would end his affair as abruptly as it had begun. "The house isn't mine to give you. Amanda transferred everything to her name months ago. The accounts, the investments, even the house. I don't actually own any of it anymore." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for so long that I wondered if Heaven had hung up. When she finally spoke, her voice was ice cold with barely controlled rage. "What do you mean the house isn't yours? You've been promising me that house for months. You said we'd be living there by Christmas. You said—" "I know what I said," Paul interrupted, his composure crumbling completely. "But it turns out Amanda knew about us the whole time. She's been planning this. She outmaneuvered me." Another silence, then, "You're telling me that you promised me a life you couldn't deliver? That you made me believe we had a future when you were just another cheating husband with delusions of grandeur?" Victoria caught my eye across the table, her expression conveying professional admiration for what we were witnessing. Heaven Cross was clearly an intelligent woman who just realized she'd wasted 8 months on a man who'd turned out to be completely powerless to deliver on his promises. "Heaven, please, we can work this out," Paul pleaded, his voice taking on a pathetic quality that made several people look away in embarrassment. "There has to be another way. Maybe we can fight the transfers. Maybe—" "Are you insane?" Heaven's voice rose to a pitch that Paul held the phone away from his ear. "You just told a room full of people that you've been having an affair with me. Your wife just destroyed you financially and probably professionally. What exactly do you think you have to offer me now?" The question hung in the air like a death sentence. Paul opened his mouth several times, but no sound emerged. What did he have to offer? No house, no money, no job security once the professional misconduct charges went public, and now no credibility with the woman he'd betrayed his family for. "Furthermore," Heaven continued, her voice gaining strength as she apparently processed the full scope of the disaster, "if you've compromised my client status with your firm, if this affair affects my investment portfolio or brings me any professional scrutiny, you'll be hearing from my attorney." Anthony Klein's head snapped up at this threat. As the senior partner, he was clearly beginning to calculate the potential legal ramifications of Paul's misconduct beyond just regulatory penalties. Client lawsuits could destroy the firm entirely. "I'll call you tomorrow," Paul said desperately, "when things have calmed down, when I can think clearly." "Don't," Heaven said firmly. "Don't call me, don't text me, don't contact me at all. As of this moment, whatever we had is over. I'm not interested in being associated with a man who's destroyed his family for nothing." The line went dead. Paul stared at his phone for a long moment, as if willing it to ring again with a different conversation, one where heaven forgave him and promised to stand by him through the disaster he'd created. Instead, the phone remained silent, and Paul was left sitting at our anniversary table, surrounded by the wreckage of every relationship that had mattered to him. His wife had outmaneuvered him completely. His daughter was looking at him with disgust. His business partner was calculating damage control, and his mistress had just abandoned him with the ruthless efficiency of someone cutting their losses. "Well," I said conversationally, breaking the stunned silence, "I suppose that settles the question of where you'll be living." Paul's face crumpled as the full reality of his situation finally hit him. He'd lost everything: his marriage, his money, his home, his lover, and quite possibly his career, all in the span of 30 minutes. The trap I'd spent 8 months setting had closed with perfect precision. The aftermath of our anniversary dinner spread through Westfield's social circles like wildfire, carrying with it the kind of scandalous details that made for weeks of whispered conversations at the country club and hushed phone calls between longtime friends. By Monday morning, everyone who mattered in our community knew exactly what had happened, and the court of public opinion had rendered its verdict with brutal efficiency. I discovered the extent of the social fallout during my regular Tuesday coffee date with the wives from our neighborhood book club. What should have been an awkward encounter, after all, these women had witnessed my husband's public betrayal just 4 days earlier, instead became something entirely different. "Amanda, darling," Margaret Strauss said as I approached their usual corner table at the Gallery Cafe, "we've been worried sick about you. How are you holding up?" But it wasn't concern I heard in her voice. It was barely concealed excitement, the kind of electric energy that surrounded a group of women who'd witnessed something so spectacularly dramatic that it would fuel their conversations for months. "I'm surprisingly well," I replied honestly, settling into the chair they'd saved for me. "Thank you all for being there Saturday night. I know it wasn't the evening any of us expected." "Expected?" laughed Caroline Klein, Anthony's wife, her perfectly manicured hands gesturing expressively. "Amanda, that was the most incredible display of strategic planning I've ever witnessed. The way you just calmly handed him those papers while he was destroying your family, it was like watching a masterclass in dignity under fire." The other women nodded in agreement, their expressions a mixture of admiration and something that looked suspiciously like awe. I realized that instead of being seen as the victim of a cheating husband, I was being regarded as someone who'd executed a brilliant campaign of justice. "Paul's reputation is absolutely finished in this town," Margaret continued, leaning forward conspiratorially. "Charles heard from the guys at the golf club that half his clients are already talking about moving their accounts. Nobody wants to work with a man who'd betray his wife so publicly." "And the affair with a client," Caroline added, shaking her head in disgust. "Anthony's been fielding calls from other firms all week. Apparently, the regulatory board is already planning an investigation. Paul's not just losing his marriage, he's losing his entire career." The professional consequences were indeed more severe than even Victoria had predicted. By Wednesday, Klein and Associates had issued a formal statement distancing the firm from Paul's personal misconduct and announcing his immediate suspension pending the outcome of regulatory proceedings. Anthony had moved quickly to protect the firm's reputation, but the damage to client confidence was already evident. "I heard from Lisa Chen," Margaret said, referring to my largest interior design client, "that Paul actually called her yesterday, trying to poach her account for some new firm he's supposedly starting. Can you imagine the audacity?" "What did she tell him?" I asked, genuinely curious about Paul's desperate attempts to salvage his career. "She told him that any man who'd treat his wife the way he treated you couldn't be trusted with her family's financial security," Carolyn replied with obvious satisfaction. Then she hung up on him. The social ostracism extended beyond just Paul's professional circles. Our longtime friends had chosen sides with a clarity that surprised even me. Dinner invitations that would normally have included both Paul and me now came addressed only to me.
Social events where Paul might have been welcomed as a single man now made it clear that his presence would be unwelcome. Speaking of which, Margaret said, pulling out her phone, James and I are having a dinner party next weekend. Small gathering, nothing fancy. We'd love to have you join us. Just you, Carolyn clarified unnecessarily. Paul isn't well. He isn't really welcome in polite society anymore. The speed and completeness of Paul's social exile was breathtaking. In less than a week, he'd gone from being a respected member of Westfield's business community to being persona non grata at every social gathering that mattered. The man who'd prided himself on his professional reputation and social connections had lost both in a single evening. But the most devastating blow to Paul's standing came from an unexpected source, his own mother. Marie Bellini, who had flown in from Phoenix specifically for our anniversary celebration, had witnessed her son's cruelty firsthand. The woman who'd raised Paul to be a gentleman, who'd instilled in him the values of honor and commitment, was horrified by what he'd become. She called me yesterday, I told the women, still processing the conversation myself. Marie did. She wanted to apologize for Paul's behavior and to tell me that she considers me her daughter, regardless of what happens with the divorce. That's incredible, Margaret breathed. His own mother is taking your side? She said that the man who announced his affair at our anniversary dinner isn't the son she raised, I continued. She's not speaking to him until he comes to his senses and makes proper amends. The women exchanged glances that spoke volumes about how completely Paul had destroyed his reputation. When a man's own mother disowned his behavior, when his professional colleagues distanced themselves from him, when his social circle closed ranks against him, there was no path back to respectability. What about Sienna? Carolyn asked gently. How is she handling all this? She's stronger than I expected, I said, thinking of my daughter's fierce loyalty and moral clarity. She told Paul that she won't speak to him until he apologizes to me properly, not some corporate non-apology, but a real acknowledgement of the pain he's caused. The complete collapse of Paul's world was more thorough than I dared hope. He'd lost not just his marriage and his money, but his reputation, his career prospects, his social standing, and his family relationships. The life he'd built over 20 years had been reduced to rubble in less than a week. 3 months after our anniversary dinner, Paul's life had settled into a pattern of quiet desperation that even I found difficult to witness. The man who had once commanded boardrooms and hosted elaborate dinner parties was now living in a studio apartment on the wrong side of town, driving a 10-year-old Honda Civic and working as a freelance financial consultant for clients who couldn't afford established firms. The regulatory board's investigation had concluded with surgical precision, stripping Paul of his Series 7 and Series 66 licenses, the credentials that had defined his professional identity for 2 decades. The official report, which Victoria had obtained through her legal channels, made for devastating reading. Gross professional misconduct, violation of fiduciary duty, and conduct detrimental to the profession were phrases that would follow Paul for the rest of his career. He's been trying to rebuild, Victoria told me during one of our monthly check-ins at her office. Apparently, he's applied to several firms in other states, hoping distance might help him escape his reputation. Any luck? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer.
Victoria's smile was grim. The financial services industry is smaller than people think. Word travels fast about someone who had an affair with a client and then lost everything to his wife. Paul's not just unemployable in Virginia, he's unemployable anywhere that matters. The financial consequences had been more severe than even our forensic accountant had predicted. Without access to the house, the investment accounts, or his former income stream, Paul had been forced to liquidate his few remaining assets just to cover basic living expenses. His BMW had been repossessed exactly 3 weeks after our anniversary dinner, just as Sarah Milliken had predicted. The watch collection he'd spent years assembling had been sold to a pawn shop. Even his golf club membership, once a symbol of his success, had been canceled when he couldn't afford the dues. But perhaps the most crushing blow had been the complete collapse of his relationship with Heaven Cross. Not only had she ended their affair immediately after his disastrous phone call, but she'd also retained her own attorney to pursue damages against Klein and Associates for Paul's professional misconduct. The lawsuit alleged that Paul had compromised her investment portfolio through his personal entanglements and sought compensation for both financial losses and emotional distress. The irony is exquisite, Victoria had explained when the lawsuit was filed. The woman Paul betrayed his family for is now suing him for the very betrayal that destroyed his marriage. Heaven's legal action had been the final nail in Paul's professional coffin. Anthony Klein, desperate to protect the firm's reputation, had settled the case quickly and quietly, but not before making it clear that Paul would be personally responsible for any damages. The settlement amount remained confidential, but sources suggested it had consumed what little money Paul had managed to keep from our asset division. Meanwhile, my own life had taken on a richness and authenticity that surprised me daily. The interior design business, freed from the constraints of being a corporate wife's hobby, had flourished beyond my wildest expectations. Without Paul's dismissive comments about my little decorating projects, I'd taken on more ambitious clients and more creative challenges. The Chen renovation had led to 3 more major projects, including a complete redesign of the mayor's historic home that had been featured in Southern Living magazine. My waiting list now extended 6 months out, and I'd been forced to hire 2 additional designers to handle the demand. "Success suits you," Sienna had observed during one of our weekly dinners together. At 17, my daughter was displaying a maturity and wisdom that made me proud every day. She'd chosen to live with me full-time, maintaining only minimal contact with her father, despite his increasingly desperate attempts to rebuild their relationship. "Your father called again yesterday," I'd told her gently, not wanting to pressure her, but believing she should know about his efforts. "What did he want?" she'd asked, her tone carefully neutral. "To apologize, to explain, to ask for another chance to be the father you deserve." Sienna had considered this for a long moment before responding. "Mom, I've been thinking about this a lot. What Dad did wasn't just wrong. It was calculated and cruel. He didn't just cheat on you. He planned to humiliate you publicly and steal everything you'd built together. That's not a mistake. That's who he chose to be." Her insight had been both heartbreaking and inspiring. My daughter understood that some betrayals were too fundamental to forgive, some choices too revealing of character to overlook. The house, once the stage for Paul's domestic fantasies with Heaven, had become truly mine in ways that went beyond legal ownership. I'd redecorated his former office into a library, converted the guest room into a yoga studio, and transformed the formal dining room, where he announced his affair, into a bright, informal space where Sienna and I hosted friends and celebrated small victories. Even the garden had been reclaimed. The rose bushes where Paul had paced during his secret phone calls with Heaven now bloomed more vibrantly than ever, tended with the care of someone who finally had the time and emotional energy to nurture beautiful things. Paul's extended consequences weren't just professional and financial, they were existential. He'd discovered that reinventing yourself at 52 was exponentially harder than he'd imagined, especially when your reputation preceded you wherever you went. The final humiliation came on a crisp October morning, exactly 1 year after our anniversary dinner. I learned about it through Caroline Klein, who called me while I was reviewing blueprints for a new client's lake house renovation.
"Amanda, you need to see today's business section," she said, her voice tight with a mixture of shock and something that sounded almost like pity. "There's an article about Paul." I found the newspaper online and read the headline with a sense of cosmic justice so perfect it almost felt scripted. "Former financial advisor declares bankruptcy, faces criminal fraud charges." The article detailed how Paul's desperate attempts to rebuild his career had led him into increasingly questionable territory. Working with clients who couldn't afford established firms, he'd apparently been cutting corners on regulatory compliance and, in at least 3 cases, had allegedly misappropriated client funds to cover his own mounting debts. The Virginia Attorney General's office has filed criminal charges against Paul Michael Bellini, 46, alleging wire fraud, securities violations, and theft of client assets totaling approximately $340,000, the article read. Mr. Bellini, who lost his professional licenses last year following an ethics investigation, had been operating without proper registration while soliciting investment clients through online platforms. I set down my coffee cup with hands that trembled slightly, not from shock, but from the overwhelming sense of vindication. Paul hadn't just failed to rebuild his life, he'd destroyed what little remained of it through his own desperation and poor judgment. The bankruptcy filing revealed the full scope of his downfall. Assets, $1,200 in a checking account and a 2015 Honda Civic worth approximately $8,000. Debts, $180,000 in legal fees from various lawsuits, $45,000 in back taxes, $25,000 owed to his former law firm, and another $67,000 in credit card debt accumulated over the past year. But it was the final paragraph that delivered the most poetic justice. Mr. Bellini is currently residing at the Westfield Men's Shelter while awaiting trial. His attorney, a public defender, declined to comment on the charges. The Westfield Men's Shelter. The man who had promised Heaven Cross a life of luxury, who had dismissed me to some little apartment somewhere, was now homeless and facing potential prison time. The trajectory from our beautiful colonial home to a homeless shelter represented a fall so complete that even I felt a moment of something approaching sympathy. But only a moment. Victoria called an hour later, having seen the same article. Amanda, I want you to know that none of this affects your divorce settlement. Your assets are completely protected, and Paul's criminal charges actually strengthen your position if he tries to challenge anything. I'm not worried about that, I said honestly. I'm just processing the fact that it's really over. Whatever version of Paul I married 20 years ago is completely gone. Some people self-destruct when they lose everything, Victoria observed. Others rebuild. Paul chose destruction. That evening, I sat in my garden with a glass of wine, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Somewhere across town, the man who had tried to steal my future was sleeping in a shelter, facing criminal charges that would likely send him to prison. I felt no satisfaction in his complete ruin, but I felt no guilt either. Paul had authored every chapter of his own downfall, starting with the choice to betray our marriage and ending with the choice to defraud desperate clients. Justice, I'd learned, wasn't always swift, but it was often thorough. 2 years after that devastating anniversary dinner, I stood in the sunlit conservatory of my home, truly my home now, reviewing the final layouts for what would become the crowning achievement of my design career. The Winchester estate renovation had been featured on the cover of Architectural Digest, and the accompanying article had described my work as a masterful blend of classical elegance and contemporary functionality that speaks to the soul of gracious living. "Mom, you've got to see this," Sienna called from the kitchen, her voice bright with excitement. At 18, she'd grown into a confident young woman who radiated the kind of authentic happiness that comes from understanding her own worth. She was home from spring break from Georgetown, where she was studying international relations with plans to attend law school, following in Victoria's footsteps rather than her father's. I found her at the kitchen island, laptop open to an email that made my heart skip with possibility. "The Smithsonian," I read aloud, hardly believing the words on the screen. "They want you to design the new First Lady's exhibition spaces?" "It gets better," Sienna grinned, scrolling down to reveal the project scope. Full creative control, unlimited budget, and they want your signature lived-in elegance approach to make the spaces feel like actual homes rather than museum displays.
The irony wasn't lost on me. 3 years ago, Paul had dismissed my work as little decorating projects while planning to give away everything I'd built. Now, those same projects had evolved into a nationally recognized design firm with a waiting list that stretched 18 months and commissions that included some of the most prestigious addresses in the country. When do they need an answer? I asked, my mind already racing with creative possibilities. Next week, but Mom, there's something else. Sienna's expression grew more serious. I ran into Dad yesterday, downtown, near the courthouse. The mention of Paul still created a small knot in my stomach, though not from hurt anymore, more like the residual tension of a wound that had healed but remained sensitive to pressure. How is he? I asked, genuinely curious. Paul had been released from minimum security prison 6 months ago after serving 18 months for the fraud charges. I'd heard through Sienna that he was working at a chain restaurant and living in a halfway house, but we'd maintained complete separation since the divorce. He looks smaller, she said thoughtfully, older. He asked about you, about the house, about my school. Then he said something that surprised me. What? He said he was proud of what you'd accomplished, that he finally understood he'd never deserved the life you'd built for him. Sienna paused, studying my face carefully. He asked me to tell you that he knows an apology could never be enough, but that he's grateful you taught him the difference between success and character. I stood quietly for a moment, processing this unexpected glimpse of the man Paul had become in his fall from grace. Perhaps losing everything had finally forced him to confront the person he'd become during our marriage's final years. And then, Sienna continued, he asked if I thought you were happy, really happy. I looked around my kitchen, the heart of a home that now reflected my authentic self rather than the perfect image I'd once maintained. Through the windows, I could see my garden in full spring bloom, every plant chosen and tended by my own hands. Beyond that, the guest house that had become my design studio, where I created beautiful spaces for families who appreciated both my talent and my integrity. What did you tell him? I asked. Sienna smiled, the kind of radiant expression that reminded me why every sacrifice had been worth it. I told him that you're not just happy, you're free, and that freedom looks beautiful on you. That evening, Victoria and I celebrated the Smithsonian Commission over dinner at Chez Laurent, the same restaurant where I'd first noticed Paul's suspicious behavior years ago. But this time, I wasn't the woman desperately trying to save a failing marriage. I was someone who'd learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone else's destruction of your life. To new beginnings, Victoria toasted, raising her glass of champagne. To endings that become beginnings, I corrected, thinking of how completely my life had transformed since that terrible night when I'd finally stopped pretending my marriage was salvageable. Outside the restaurant windows, Westfield's spring evening was alive with possibility. Somewhere in the city, Paul was presumably learning to build a life based on humility rather than entitlement. Somewhere else, Sienna was planning her own bright future, with the confidence of a young woman who'd seen her mother survive betrayal and emerge stronger. And here, in this moment, I was exactly where I belonged, successful, respected, genuinely content, and completely free to write my own story. The woman who'd handed Paul that envelope 2 years ago had been protecting herself. The woman sitting here now was celebrating herself. The difference, I'd learned, was everything.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.